Good morning. Thank you for joining me. Today I will present an overview and forensic analysis of the West Mesa Homicide case, an unsolved case where multiple victims were discovered in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 2009. My presentation will cover the discovery and background, the victim's biological and antemortem characteristics, the forensic anthropological findings, including limits on perimortem trauma analysis, postmortem, and taphonomic factors. I will also cover investigative challenges and the lessons learned from this case. I will conclude with the current status of the case and implications for forensic practice and community response. Let's begin. In this case, 11 female victims who disappeared between 2003 and 2005 were eventually recovered from a single burial site on Albuquerque's West Mesa in 2009. From the beginning, the investigation faced major forensic challenges. The remains were in an advanced state of skeletonization, which limited the amount of perimortem trauma that could be identified. In addition, many of the victims came from marginalized backgrounds, which affect both reporting and early investigative efforts. This case remains unsolved to this day, though it continues to receive attention through cold case initiatives and community memorialization efforts. The discovery itself happened by chance. A dog uncovered an exposed bone along a walking trail. Later analysis showed that the site had been disturbed by nearby development, which likely contributed to the bones becoming visible. Following the discovery, the Albuquerque Police Department created a dedicated task force, and the FBI assisted with several aspects of the investigation. Forensic experts from the Office of the Medical Investigator, along with the university osteology specialist, played crucial roles in analyzing the remains and helping to reconstruct the burial context. The discovery occurred on February 2nd, 2009, when a single bone was found on the West Mesa. This initial finding led investigators to conduct a full excavation, which ultimately uncovered multiple clandestine burials. The victims were determined to have disappeared between May 2003 and September 2004, although some reports suggest burials may have occurred any time between 2001 and 2005. The burial site itself was located along the Arroyo Bank near 118th Street Southwest. Satellite imagery later revealed that the soil in this area had been disturbed by between 2003 and 2005, which aligns with the estimated time period of the murders. The land had originally been slated for development, but when construction halted, the exposed and shifting soil likely contributed to the eventual discovery of the remains. The biological profile of the victims showed that there were 11 women in total, ranging in age from about 15 to their early 30s. Most of the victims were Hispanic, and one of them, 15-year-old Silania Edwards, was from out of state. Many of these women had histories involving sex work and substance use, and those circumstances shaped both the investigative direction and the way the case was portrayed in the media. To identify the remains, investigators used a combination of forensic anthropology, DNA profiling, dental comparisons, and information provided by the victims' families. Identification was often challenging because several of the women had irregular or limited contact with institutions, meaning their missing person reports were delayed or incomplete. Some of the victims also operated within the same geographic areas and street networks, which helped investigators recognize patterns but also underscored how vulnerable these communities were. As part of the investigation, the Albuquerque Police Department compiled lists of missing women from 2001 through 2006 who shared similar backgrounds. This helped them narrow down possible identities as remains were recovered. The case had a significant impact on the community. Families of the victims formed support groups and actively advocated for continued investigation, ensuring that the case was never forgotten. The antemortem characteristics of the victims reveal several important patterns. The women range in age from about 15 to 32, and many had histories involving sex work and substance use. These backgrounds place them in high risk environments, such as street work, unstable housing, and situations involving addiction, which significantly increase their vulnerability to violence. A major factor that affected both the timeline and the investigation was social marginalization. Many of these victims were part of underserved, low visibility communities, which meant their disappearances weren't always reported right away or weren't taken as seriously as they should have been. As a result, several victims had been missing for months or even years before their remains were eventually discovered. Based on the victim profiles, investigators believe the offender likely targeted women who were easily accessible and isolated, with limited protection or social support systems. These patterns suggest opportunity based targeting rather than a highly specific personal motive. Because the victims were found in a fully skeletonized state, investigators relied heavily on ante-mortem records to establish identity. Dental records, DNA from family members, and missing person reports became essential tools since there was no soft tissue left to support the traditional identification methods. These records were crucial in reconstructing who these women were before their deaths. When examining the cause of death in the West Mesa homicide case, the Office of the Medical Investigator officially ruled the deaths as homicidal violence. However, the exact mechanisms, whether strangulation, stabbing, blunt force trauma, or any other method, could not be determined. This is largely because all the victims were found in a fully skeletonized state. Years of burial led to advanced decomposition, complete loss of soft tissue, and frequent fragmentation of the skeletons, all of which severely limited what investigators could interpret. The absence of soft tissue created major challenges for identifying perimortem trauma. For example, ligature marks, bruising, sharp force injuries, and many internal injuries leave no trace on bone. Even fractures can be difficult to interpret. Many of the bones show no clear perimortem breaks, which could be a result of the killer using methods that don't reliably damage bone, or it could simply be that post-mortem environmental damage obscured any trauma that once existed. Taphonomic processes played a major role in this case. Soil erosion, animal activity, root growth, and natural weathering all affected the remains over the years. These processes can mimic or erase trauma patterns, making it extremely difficult to determine what happened at or near the time of death versus what happened long after death. Due to these limitations, forensic anthropologists had to rely on alternative methods of identification. Dental records, DNA comparisons with family members, ancestry and age estimation, and general biological profiling became essential because traditional autopsy evidence was simply unavailable. Ultimately, the lack of detailed peri-mortem evidence meant investigators were unable to determine a consistent kill method or identify an offender's signature. Without this type of forensic linkage, building a behavioral profile or narrowing down suspects became more challenging. This is one of the key reasons the case remains unsolved today. Looking at the post-mortem information, the burial pattern provides important context. All of the victims were interred in a clandestine grave area on the West Mesa. Some of the burials were clustered together while others were more spread out, suggesting that the site was used repeatedly over a window of several years rather than a single event. This pattern aligns with the known disappearance timeline of the victims. Taphonomic factors heavily influence the condition of the remains. Soil composition, long-term weather exposure, and the earlier site disturbance from halted construction all contributed to the varying levels of preservation. These environmental effects often broke down bone, displaced skeletal elements, or altered their surfaces. It's also worth noting that in 2018 additional bones were discovered near the site, but the Office of the Medical Investigator determined those remains were ancient and unrelated to the West Mesa homicides. Because of the age of the burials and the environment in which they were found, trace evidence was extremely limited. Items such as fibers, fingerprints, or weapon fragments were either absent or too degraded to be useful. As a result, investigators relied heavily on other forms of evidence. They used DNA testing, comparisons with missing person photographs, and contextual clues from the burial locations to pursue leads and identify victims. Even with these tools, the condition of the site made it one of the most challenging forensic recovery operations in New Mexico's history. In terms of case resolution, the official status remains unchanged. The West Mesa homicide case is still unsolved. As of the most recent reporting, no individual has ever been prosecuted or formally charged in connection with the burials. Over the years, multiple persons of interest have been identified by both investigators and the media. These individuals often had histories of violence against sex workers or connections to the geographic areas where the victims disappeared. However, despite extensive questioning and investigation, none of these individuals have been definitively tied to the West Mesa homicides, and no charges have been filed. The case continues to receive attention. Periodic public appeals and reward offerings have been issued in hopes of generating new leads. Between 2004 and 2005, or be- between 2024 and 2025, there have been renewed cold case reviews and investigative efforts reflecting the ongoing commitment to seeking justice for the victims and their families. While the case remains open, it also serves as a reminder of the challenges investigators face when working with severely degraded remains and limited forensic evidence. When we look at the lessons learned from the West Mesa case, several key themes emerge. First, from a forensic practice standpoint, this investigation highlights the importance of early, careful recovery of remains. Using archaeological excavation methods such as mapping, stratigraphic recording, and controlled soil removal significantly improves the amount and quality of evidence recovered in skeletonized cases. These techniques help preserve context, which can be just as important as the bones themselves. From an investigative perspective, the case shows the need for sustained outreach and better data sharing when working with marginalized victim populations. Many of the women in the case were not immediately reported missing, or their reports were incomplete. Cross-jurisdictional systems like DNA databases and missing person registries are essential to ensuring these individuals are identified quickly and not overlooked. Finally, there are important policy and community lessons. Public memorialization, such as the Women's Memorial Park, established at the West Mesa site, helps keep the victims' stories alive and supports their families. Transparency and community engagement build trust and encourage tips from the public. Additionally, continued funding for cold case units and legislation supporting long-term investigations help maintain investigative momentum in cases like this, where answers may come years or even decades later. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate your time and attention.